Thank you for coming. I'm pretty impressed with the number of attendees, but it looks like PowerShell is becoming more popular. I will talk today about PowerShell workflows and give you some kind of introduction to talks that you will hear later about SMA and Azure Automation presented by Jakob and David O'Brien and Trond. So I will talk really about PowerShell workflow basics and touch just a little of SMA and Azure Automation. So who am I? My name is Aleksandar Nikolic. I'm a PowerShell MVP for Windows PowerShell. I'm also owner of Mosakati Consulting, co-founder of PowerShellMagazine.com and community manager of PowerShell.com. You can find me on Twitter, and I presume that if you're interested in PowerShell, then Twitter is a pretty good place to be because we share a lot of information there. So what is a Windows PowerShell workflow? Basically, it's just another command, and workflow consists of commands that are ordered sequence of activities, not commandlets, but activities. That's something that it's new. It looks like commandlet, it looks like a PowerShell script, but it's not, and you will see later more about those differences because that's really important to understand. PowerShell workflow is introduced in PowerShell 3 with Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012, and it's also part of all the newer versions of newer operating systems. What's really interesting and very different than before when we talk about PowerShell scripts is that you can suspend and resume workflows. You can also continue. If you have some problem with the network outage, you can continue. If you target a computer and it's restarted, the workflow will continue running later. Those are the things that we didn't have before. We don't have that capabilities with just the plain PowerShell scripts. So when you can think about using really PowerShell workflows, one of the main points is when you run a long-running task, and you need to combine multiple steps. You need to target a multiple number of machines because the support for remoting is already built in with the workflows. You don't even need to do anything. You will get it free. When you need a task where you have a process is when you need to checkpoint stuff, so to save a state in variables at some point, and then do some interruption, for example, to get some approval from a manager that you can continue, change something, and then continue, then you can think about, OK, the workflow is the right for me. It can survive a restart. Parallelism is an interesting thing, and usually people are kind of fond of using workflows just because of parallelism, and I will talk a lot about that because I see a lot of wrong examples all around the internet, but people just don't understand it because sometimes you can get the parallel execution much more easier if you use a plain PowerShell remoting. Why? Because PowerShell remoting is able to run concurrently by default, targeting 32 machines. So if the parallelism is the only thing that you really want to do, you don't need to go to workflows because they're more complex. Pick an easier solution for it. There are two different ways to write PowerShell workflows. You can use a script language, PowerShell script language, and PowerShell syntax that you know already, or you can use a XAML. Do you think that you will write it using that thing on a, right? So the point is that the PowerShell team put a lot of effort to make it easier for us to create workflows, leveraging all the knowledge that we already have just working with PowerShell. But the basic, the foundation of workflows is really a XAML. That's a native language for Windows workflows because workflows will be executed by Windows Workflow Foundation engine, not by PowerShell. We will just use a PowerShell syntax to write them. But then the other engine will take care of them and execute them. So the PowerShell workflows look like PowerShell scripts, but they just use the syntax of it. And some people are, especially in the beginning, very confused with that because that other engine and the XAML as a final result of everything that you are doing is introducing some limitations. So you cannot really write PowerShell workflows in absolutely the same way as you do when you write PowerShell scripts. You can also author workflows if you use a Visual Studio Workflow Designer. Some people do that. Or if you already have workflows written as XAMLs, you can import them into your PowerShell session and use them as a part of a PowerShell session as well. One of the main differences here is that we have commandlets with PowerShell scripts, and we have activities when we work with PowerShell workflows. They look the same. It's like a get process activity and get process commandlet, right? But when they are put into a workflow, they are activities. Don't think about them as commandlets. They just look the same, but behave a little differently. And also, each activity within a workflow can run in a different run space. That's something that is very different than with the scripts when they share the run space. There's one great benefit with PowerShell workflows that people sometimes are not aware of, that we get workflow common parameters for free. As when you write an advanced PowerShell function, you get common parameters free, just when you use commandlet binding attribute or parameter attribute. Here, as long as you write a workflow, you get the workflow common parameters, and you will see how many of them, and they can really make your job much more easier because you don't need to take care of all those things by yourself, especially for supporting remoting and some other things. All of them are optional, and they need to be named. So you cannot, they are not positional. You cannot just skip them. There is a great help topic that covers all of them. I really recommend you to read it, about workflow common parameters. So here they are. As you can see, most of them are prefixed with a PS. So as we have computer name as one of the common ones for targeting remote machines, when you work with the workflows, the parameter is PS computer name. PS is, as a prefix is something that PowerShell team is using. So recommendation and best practices that whatever you do, try to avoid using PS, because maybe in the future, if it's not already taken for something, maybe in the future PowerShell team will take it, and then you will have a conflicts naming stuff. So try to avoid that PS. See also that there are some that are not using PS as job and a job name, but as you know, they try to be consistent, but sometimes they are not. Most of those commandlets, as you, parameters, as they can see, are there to work and support remoting. So let's look at a demo first, and it's easier to look through the demos. Okay, here it is. So this is a very simple workflow. It looks almost like a function, and under the hood, workflows are functions. But when you run it like this, you will just define a workflow, and you will run it in the same way as you run a function. You will just call it by name, and it will execute and output hello world by default, because that's the default value. But when you look at the get command, you will see that we have now a new command type. It's a type of workflow, right? Here, we have workflows. If we look at the syntax, you see that even if I didn't have, if I had only one parameter, name, I get all those common parameters and also workflow common parameters. So how can you see them from a PowerShell? You can use a show command, get a nice GUI for it, have a common parameters here, and then you have here a combination of common and workflow common parameters. So there's a lot of them here, just if you want to remind yourself of what's possible to use, or you can even run them from there. It's also supported for tab completion and IntelliSense and all those things, so you will see that easily. Let's look at the result of that definition of a workflow of that XAML that I talk about. So we use a PowerShell syntax to write it really simply, that hello world example, but look what's generated for us. This is a XAML that is generated by a workflow, by a PowerShell for us, and the workflow engine will execute this. You didn't expect that, right? So it's hard work is on PowerShell. So it's PowerShell responsibility to create these things that the workflow engine will understand. But how we get all those common workflow parameters? What's also created is a script block, and I will just output it to a file and load it into a ISC. There's a nice function that works only in ISC called psedit that will import your script into our ISC if you are never aware of that. And you can see here that all those workflow common parameters we get here produced by PowerShell as well. I will just say like 400 lines of code. It's produced for us. So we get that great support for all those parameters without writing a single line of code, just using a workflow keyword. It's impressive, really. I really like that part. I don't want to write all those code myself, right? What's also really interesting is that if I go now to completely new run space that doesn't know anything about my previous actions, by the way, here's a nice trick to do comment blocking, like a block selection of thing. You press left button on your mouse, and then Alt, and then you do this, and erase things. It's kind of a nice trick. So here in this new run space, getGreeting doesn't know anything about, this run space doesn't know anything about getGreeting. That command doesn't exist in this session. Also, do you like that now I have error messages that you can read? Because I changed the background color for error messages, so I presume that you can read it easily now, instead when it's red on blue. So I'm already, I'm changing to my workflow folder, and I will show you a XAML file that I created before and copied this into a XAML file. So now I can import a module practically pointing to that XAML file, and look what happens. I'm getting extracted commands from the workflow. And now I can run getGreeting, get hello Oslo. Right? So it's the same way. Like here, you can get that XAML file from someone who created that in a Visual Studio, for example. And you will import the module, get all commands from it, and you can run them like you have written them in a PowerShell session. It's pretty cool. So XAML, XAML, XAML. I will not talk more about that later, but I just wanted to show you the differences. Okay, what's going on now? Okay. Activity is a basic unit of work in workflows. Every command and expression that runs in a workflow runs as an activity. A PowerShell team tried to create and map all the PowerShell core commandlets into activities. But we cannot expect from other PowerShell groups inside of Microsoft to do that as well, or other vendors. So if a commandlet is not explicitly excluded from a list, it will run implicitly as activity and as some special activity that you will see a little bit later. You can also nest workflows, so you can create a workflow and then run it in your parent workflow as a child workflow. That also works. That magic activity is called Inline Script. So Inline Script runs all commands that you put in that script block in a shared Windows PowerShell session. So when you run workflows, all other activities will be executed by a workflow engine. But when the execution comes to Inline Script, then suddenly the PowerShell, behind the scenes, the PowerShell exe is started, and that the PowerShell exe executes all those commands inside of an inline script block in a completely separate session. So because of that, you need to be aware of few differences when you put things there. For example, one of the things is that variables defined in a workflow cannot be directly used in inline script block. You need to use a using script modifier. If you worked with PowerShell remoting before, you are aware of existence of using script scope modifier because it used it before to bring the local variable into our remoting block of invoke command, right? Or if you work with the background jobs, the same thing is applied. So that using scope modifier is really crucial there. You can use inline script block mostly to run commands that cannot be run otherwise in a workflow. Or if you need commands that need to share data between them. There's also a small number of excluded commandlets. Why they need to exclude some of the commands? If commands need to work interactively with you, then you cannot put them directly into a workflow because the workflow is not there to be used interactively. It's there to be scheduled or to run for a really long time, and you don't want to wait for 2 hours to get some interactive message saying, okay, now input some data and I will continue, right? So if there is a commandlet that it's not, doesn't have a matching activity, then that command will run implicitly in the inline script block. And you will see that in a demo, how that works. But if you have excluded one, then you can put excluded commandlet in an inline script block, and sometimes it makes sense, and it will run for you. Here is a list of excluded commandlets. Some of them are obvious because they are interactive, like out grid view, debug process as well. But for example, import module that I discovered recently is not part of the documentation. Officially, they miss it for some reason. You cannot use, but you have a special parameter that will import module for you. And I will show you that. Also enter exit PS session, all those things you cannot run inside of our workflows. They are excluded. As we have a common workflow parameters, we also have a common activity parameters. And that's pretty cool, because then you can, on an activity level, pass some values and get some results that were not possible before. And there is no way for you to parameterize that, so you get that free. There are two activities that cannot support any of our common activity parameters: suspend workflow and checkpoint workflow. There is a great list of those activity parameters. I'm putting all that stuff here, not for you to read it now or for me to read it, but for you to have a reference later when you get a PowerPoint, so you will have all that information in one place. So when we talk about activities, here I have one example when I have different kinds of activities. Get process is really activity. So it's implemented as activity. It does look like a commandlet, but it's activity. That get Windows feature will run implicitly in inline script block because it's not implemented as activity, and also it's not excluded. Get variable commandlet is one on the list on excluded ones, so I need to wrap it in inline script block. And then I have this expression, and when I run expression, it runs is write output activity. So let me try to define this workflow, clear a screen, and look at the XAML for this one. And you can see here, for example, for expression, where I'm, PowerShell ISC, so get process, that's activity. Then I have an inline script block for Windows feature, implicitly, because I didn't define it, but it's wrapped in inline script block. For get variable, I really have inline script block here, and for expression, here I have write output activity. So all those things are there on a screen just for you to see the differences. When you run it and when you work with workflows, you will never go here. But it's important to understand that things are really different when we work with the workflow compared to everything else before when we only work with a simple, or not so simple, PowerShell scripts. And I can run that against a remote machine using PS computer name workflow command parameter. I didn't define it. I didn't have any parameter. But it will work against a remote machine producing some results. And I will get results for all the things. You can see here that I'm getting information about the process. I'm getting information about if PowerShell is installed or not. Formatting is a little bit different here because the formatting system doesn't work on this in the process of working with workflows. We are not working with the live objects, but with the serialized one. So things are a little bit different, but you need to kind of deal with that. And then we have expression here. We start a little bit later, so I will skip a few demos here and there, just to make it faster. But here I want to show you that if I have this P variable defined on the top of a workflow, and I need to use a using scope modifier like this if I want that variable to be visible inside of an inline script block. So if I can run this, then you will see that I have a PowerShell expanded as from a variable inside of inline script block. Without that using, I will just get value of P variable in inline script block is and nothing, because the inline script block will not be aware of a variable. There's one interesting thing that I want to show you here is that I have a workflow here that inside of a workflow I will read the content of a server's txt file. That file contains only the names of the 3 machines that I'm running in my test domain. And I will run them directly on a machine that it's called demo1. And I will get results from all 3 machines that are in that file. But look what happens if I try to run this workflow on a remote machine. If I do that, first I get error that the file could not be found, right? Because that file exists only on my local machine, and I send the workflow to the remote machine. There is no file there, so the workflow cannot read it. But I still got some results. And that results is not coming from that remote machine. Results is coming from my local machine, which is really strange, right? So you need to be very aware of that, that if you pass a null or empty value here to your PS computer parameter for activity, you will get local results. Be very aware of that. It's really hard to troubleshoot that, and it can be tricky, because you will get some errors, and at the end you will get results, but results are coming from your local machine, not the remote one. It can be strange, and you don't get any warnings about it. That's the worst part, right? So if you're not aware of that fact, and it's hidden in the documentation, but usually people don't read documentation that thoroughly, and they will miss it. Computer name is really, or PS computer name is really important parameter, and it's really important to understand it properly, because it can save you a lot of work. So for example, people usually say, I can work with the workflows as I work with the PowerShell scripts, right, with a function. So I have here a very simple function with a computer name parameter. It uses getSim instance to get information about Win32 computer system class. I can run it against 2 remote machines, and I will get easy results. Here I only change a function keyword to a workflow keyword and the name, but that's the code inside is absolutely the same, and I will get error. And the error says you cannot use a computer name parameter. You need to use PS computer name. And the error is good. So I know that I can change it. So I'm changing here a name of parameter to PS computer name. And when I run it, it runs and produces results. But then there is another thing. I don't even need to use to put here computer name or any parameters here, because there is an automatic variable called PS computer name as well that maps to a value that you pass to PS computer name parameter. So it really makes your code simpler. So I don't have any parameters here, and things are really working great. And for this specific case, because that's how my content or workflow runs, because the workflow will be sent directly to a target machine and executed on a target machine, I can just use a PS computer name parameter here without any kind of parameterization or even variables here, and I will get results. But this is a specific for this demo command, okay? Because it will be, workflow will be sent to a remote machine and executed directly on a remote machine. So I'm fine with this. I don't need to use. So you see how you can simplify things if you know how to deal with that. We have lots of special activities here. I mentioned Inline Script, that it's the end here. We have a checkpoint workflow and suspend workflow. And we have for each parallel and parallel. Very interesting one, and people usually like workflows just because of that parallelism. Unfortunately, they use it in the wrong way. But I will show you a little bit later how to use it in a better way. So first thing is that we need to understand how things are working. For each parallel, execute items in a collection in a parallel way. But all the code that it's in a script block is executed sequentially. And this is one thing that I put on a screen that it's in documentation, but hardly ever notice that when you work with a PS computer name workflow parameter, everything runs always in parallel by default. You don't need to use for each parallel and then computer in PS computer name variable. That's not needed. Every time when you work with a PS computer name, everything runs in parallel by default. Use that, for example, if you need to run against multiple disks, then use disk to run in parallel against them, but not computers. Computers are in parallel by default. Don't waste your time on that. Your code will be simpler. The parallel script block is interesting. Everything that runs in a parallel script block runs in parallel, every single activity. And they can run concurrently or in any other order. You don't have any control on that. Absolutely no control. But if you need to put some activities inside of a parallel block and you need to run them sequentially, then you have a sequence block. And you put a sequence block inside, and then you have a control on that. What I've seen a lot on the internet is the people are using sequence block outside of parallel block. It doesn't hurt, but it's completely meaningless. Sequence doesn't make sense outside of parallel block. Why? Because all activities by default runs sequentially anyway. So you will not gain anything. It will not hurt, you will not get the error message. It's valid, but it doesn't make sense. So try to avoid that. Sequence is only combined with a parallel block. If you don't use a parallel block, forget about sequence as well. You will not get anything with it. So by default, for each parallel from PowerShell 4 and newer, executes all items in collection. In PowerShell 3, we have execution limited to just 5. That changed because they introduced a new parameter for controlling how many items you will execute. So what I have here is that I will define a list of 20 servers, and then I will run for each parallel against 20 of them and have some sleep in the end. So if I define this and run it, you will see immediately I get all 20 of them in just one run, in parallel. Bam, all of them. Pretty cool. But sometimes you need to have a better control, and you don't want to run all 20, so you have a new parameter introduced in PowerShell 4 core throttle limit. And here I have, again, 20 server on a list, but I want to run only 10 in parallel first, and then sleep a little and get 10 more. So I'm getting 10. Some action can be executed against those 10. Sleep a little and then get another. So I've had in like 2 batches of 10. What's really interesting here is that I will work here against 10 servers, but I will run only first 3 and then second 3 and then third 3 and then the 10th one at the end. And you can see that I'm running things in a way that they need to finish the first 3. So this is before sleep. Then I have 3 after sleep, and then next 3, next 3. And what's interesting, at the end here, you can see that I got 7th immediately when the process for the server 10, immediately when process for 7th finished. So it's absolutely the same as with invoke command and PowerShell remoting. Remember, there we have a throw limit by default of 32. How that works? You run invoke command against 100 servers. It will run by default against 32. And then all the others will be in queue, waiting for someone to output results. As soon as one of them output results, the next one is coming into a pipeline, and it's, the command is executed against it. This is a really interesting thing. What will happen if I have inline script block inside of that for each parallel block? So I have here practically the same thing. 20 servers. I want to limit execution 10 by 10, but I have an inline script block here. So I will define the function and see what happens. I will also execute a new process to show you that I got 5 new PowerShell sessions behind the scenes, and I have that limitation of 5 by 5. Doesn't matter that I said I want 10. Why is that? Because when we work with the inline script blocks, we are limited by a maximum activity process parameter on a session. And also, there is a session configuration specifically made for working with workflows called Microsoft PowerShell Workflow. Session configuration, if you are not aware of that, is the endpoint that you connect to when you work with PowerShell remoting. Usually you connect to default one called Microsoft.PowerShell. They created a special one called Microsoft PowerShell Workflow for working with the workflows because it had a better support for workflows in it. And I will give you here a list of all those properties that start with a max, and you can see the maximum activity process is set to 5. That's the reason why even if I set throttle limit to 10, if I have inline script, I will get only 5 by 5. Can I change that? Yes, I can. So I can create a new execution option, say, okay, this is, let's limit it to 100, and I properly name it to CPU killer, because that means that if you want, you can try to get 100 PowerShell processes running for you, and I don't recommend it, but this is what I have here. And I also already have this defined. So how can you work against it? You need to create a session, like when you are working with a PowerShell remoting session, using that configuration name that I've just created. And then run first define a workflow inside of that session. That's the first part here. Or you can just import it from a module. You will see that a little bit later. So you have 20 servers here, limited by 10. And I will run now a workflow inside of that specially made session that has a limit of 100%. So the throttle limit is 10. And if everything is right, I will get 10 processes here. I'm running this as a new one because it's busy. The other one is busy. So you see, now I had 10. You need to really experiment with this and to check if this is something that you can change. They didn't put that limit of 5 without any reasons, right? So you need to see if your machine is powerful enough to run this, but there is a way to, and you can see that it's still running. It executes limited to those 10. So there is a way to change it, but I cannot tell you if it works with your machine better if you change it, or if you just follow the rules and use the limit of 5. You can also have a for each parallel inside of for each parallel. So for example, in this, I have a list of servers, and then I have a list of databases. So I want, for example, those 10 servers to run 3 in parallel, and then of 8 databases, I want to run just 5 of them. And then you will see when I execute these things that how they execute. I will put this verbose here and give you a chance to see. So it will start 3 servers, and then 5 databases per server, and then it will add another 3 databases for any those servers. So when it's done with them, it will start processing a new server in a batch of 5 databases. So it's pretty cool to look at this, but it's a good thing that we can easily nested those things and have all that parallelism, so it can work really nicely with some scenarios. And then for 10, I will get first 5, and then the next remaining 3, and that's it. I will skip this one and show you this one. This one is kind of interesting. I will copy I have a workflow to copy files in parallel. I have 5 files of 100 megabytes each. And I will measure the execution time for a workflow. So you can see here, I'm getting all of them in parallel. They're still not copied completely. The icon is not changed for them. We need to wait. Also, command is running. So I process them in parallel, but is that really faster than if I do that in the old way? Let's see. So I needed for this 20 seconds. Okay? I will now delete them, and then I will measure how that will work if I run them sequentially using a pipeline. So here I have 1 by 1 copied, right? What do you expect? Workflow to be faster because it runs in parallel? Or this one? So this one is faster. So you always need to test. It doesn't matter that if you do something in parallel that you will get results much more quicker. This is a simple example, but I remind you, always test. Don't assume that just because you use a parallelism, you will get things faster. Okay. It's also very important to configure your workflow environment properly. What people do, especially during the demos, they execute everything from one machine. They run the workflows on, they create workflows on them, they run workflows on them. But in production, you should think about a different way. You create your workflow on your, you practically run your workflows from a middle server, from a workflow, let's call them workflow server. So you just use your admin station to connect to a special session configuration for workflows on that workflow server, and then execute workflows from that server. The best practice is to put all your workflows in a module, in one of those paths that are in a PS module path environmental variable, so it will be loaded automatically. And you will see what I'm talking about if I show you a demo. But I have another demo for a parallel thing, showing you a parallel block and sequence. So what I have here is a number of fixes, put it in a variable fixes. I have a parallel, so I have all those independent activities. That's the important thing. They are independent, so they can run in any order they like. I don't care. So I have get process, get service. They don't depend on each other. And then in a sequence, I have here a for each for those fixes when I want to get a report. A report and anything that you put in a file is kind of a tricky when you want to use that in parallel, because you will get exclusive lock on a file. So the good thing is to first collect your results in a variable and then output that variable to a file. That way you will avoid that lock of a file. Don't try to run it in parallel, because you will write a first one and then you will get error that the file is already used by another process. So just to show you how this works is I define it, and then when I run it, I will get in parallel results about process, about service, and then it will start processing this sequence block, getting output, and when it's done, I can see that I have all the information about knowledge base, about hotfixes written in a file. So it's really, really good to use it, and it's really effective when you work with independent commandlets. But let's get back to this how to properly configure workflow environment. So the main thing here is that I want to show you this difference between session configuration for default one for remoting and the one that it's created for workflows. So first here you say use shared process. It's set to false for PowerShell remoting. For workflows, it's set to true, because we want to reuse a process where we run a workflow, except for inline activity. It will run outside of a process, and it's also defined here. I have all those maximum things that are not even existing here, but one of the interesting things is that if I get you all the properties for this special session configuration, you will see, I made a mistake here, okay, Control A, okay, that inline script here, out of process activity, inline script. So this is when it's defined that inline script will run outside of a process in a completely new PowerShell exe, okay? You can even change that, but I don't recommend it. So we have a new PS workflow session commandlet that it's part of PS workflow module, and it's created just to give you kind of a wrapper around new PS session so that you don't need to specify Microsoft PowerShell workflow name for session configuration all the time. So instead of that, you will just say new PS workflow session. It will create that special kind of a session configuration for you. So how it runs when we use that? I will create the workflow type of a session to my demo 2 machine, and then create a workflow inside of that session that will target getSim instance to get information about Win32 computer system class. Locally, I have that server list. I will put it in a variable, and this is practically a PowerShell remoting call. ICM is invoke command for that function, calling workflow using PS computer name workflow common parameter, using a using scope modifier to pass the local variable into a script block for invoke command. What will happen is that I will get answer from that remote machine, but I will get some strange errors for others. Why? Because I need to pass fresh credentials. So I will try to type a password and to speak at the same time, which is also very stupid, usually, but I will try to make it right. Let's hope that everything was fine. Yes. So I got now output from all 3 remote machines. What's even better is that, and this is one of the ways that you can do it. You can create a completely special. So this worked this time, but sometimes you will need to jump from that workflow session, workflow server, to some other server, and then from that server further, and you will have a problem with a double hop. To resolve the problem, you can define that workflow session using run as credentials. And for run as credentials, you will use some account that has access to those further remote machines. So if you have that, then I created that on remote machines so that I can jump easily from then getting a fresh credentials from a session configuration. But be aware that if you use account that has a lot of privileges, you need to treat this server almost as a domain controller. If you by any chance use a domain admin account as a run as credentials, and someone takes care of your server, some malicious user, he can use a Mimikatz hacker tool to get all information about that account from your memory of the server. So be aware of that you need to treat that server then in a very special way, almost like a domain controller. Seriously. And as I told you, if I put all my workflows in a module, and I put that module in a path that it's recognized by PowerShell, then I can make it even easier. And here I'm doing exactly that. I'm creating a new session on a PowerShell Demo 2 machine, and I'm just calling a workflow without creating it here first, because I have a module that contains few workflows on that remote machine. It will just run. You don't even need to import it. And if everything is all right, I should get information again about all those machines. And that's really the clean and best way to do it. So I have one machine that is specific for working with the workflows. It's pretty cool. We didn't mention that, but because workflows are created to run for a long time, then we can leverage background jobs, right? Because we don't want to wait for all those results. I have here one simple workflow that will give me the output of all installed features. And let me clean a little bit first. So I will run it against 3 remote machines, but as a job. And you can see here that it's not even started at this moment. You can use all the job commandlets to work with workflow jobs. So here you have a new job type called workflow job. It says it's completed. I can include child jobs and see that I have a parent job that controls the execution of all those remote machines. And then for every single remote machine, I have a child job. So how can I get results just for specific remote machine? I will just say, OK, give me a result using that location is a demo 2 and receive a job for it. And I will get all the features installed on demo 2 machine. If I change location to DC, I will get all the features that are installed and roles that are installed on demo C. So you have a pretty good control on that. What I want to show you here as well is how to work with suspending workflows. And that's really kind of interesting scenario. So you will suspend the workflow, you will disconnect your client from that session, reconnect from another computer, and resume a workflow and get results. It's a very complex scenario, but it works very well. So what I do here, I will create a new workflow session on a demo 2 machine, and I will name it so that it's easier for me to get back information about it, because maybe I have a lot of sessions because I'm running this presentation for an hour, and who knows what I created in the meantime. So that name is kind of useful for reference. So I will create a session, And inside of that session, I will define a workflow that will output some information in a file before I suspend the workflow. Then I will suspend the workflow, and then you will see that I have a command after suspending that will also run. They are properly named before suspend txt and after resume txt. So I will first define a workflow and then call it. You can see that immediately a state is suspended because I have a suspend workflow, and it ran up to this point, and then it was suspended. So now I can disconnect myself from this session and go to completely new machine, and a new run space will play that role for me. So this is a run space that doesn't know anything about previously typed commands, right? It's like a new machine. So let's check what's on a C drive, and you can see before suspend txt. So that's already produced by my workflow, but I need rest, right? So how can I get it? I can use get ps session to enumerate what's available of sessions on that demo2 machine. And I can see that I have a few. But one that I need is there, and it's called suspend wf demo. So I can try to connect to that machine, to that specific session, and get results. So now it was disconnected. Now it's opened. I can get a list of jobs, and I can see that there is one job that it's suspended. So I will here get a name of that job because I want to reference dynamically. And here I will get a reference to that job and then resume a job and wait for it to finish. So it's running. I will wait for it, wait, and receive results. So now what I expect to have here, I expect here to have both before suspend and after resume. So I successfully resumed my workflow and got all the commands after suspend workflow easily from a different machine, which is absolutely fantastic, if you ask me. I will do some cleanup here. And I just want to show you some wrong examples published, unfortunately, on a Microsoft own blog. See here, we have a very simple workflow that will uninstall PowerShell IC. I mean, that's wrong completely, but OK, that's example that they used. And then they will restart machine and check for existence of that Windows feature. What is wrong in this workflow? We have two mistakes. Can you spot the first one? What we have here? We have a parallel block. What runs in this parallel block? A single activity. So what kind of parallelism you get when you have one activity in a single block, in a parallel block? There is no parallelism. Then you have a sequence outside of parallel block. So this will work exactly the same if it's not in a sequence block. So if you remove a parallel completely and remove a sequence, you will get absolutely the same functionality. Okay? Another example. We have here environment. We have a domain controller, a client, and two servers. So the author first create a workflow session against domain controller. Please, never ever do this. Please. Not even for demos. Not even for your mother. I mean, seriously. That's absolutely stupid. Then what it does, it runs a invoke command against that workflow session, importing a module. So remember, this workflow session is created on domain controller. So it connects to to domain controller, and then it imports a module using a network share on domain controller. I mean, if you are already there, use a simple path, not a network share, because you are already on domain controller. The other thing is, you don't even need to import those things. Why? Because you have from PowerShell 3 support for auto loading of modules, right? So you don't need to do that at all. But anyway, so he established all that thing remotely on the domain controller, and then he runs a domain Active Directory commandlet locally on a machine. So why he didn't even bother to connect those to that domain controller when he now runs things locally? I don't understand it. And then you have a pretty complex things here that kind of weird. But let's talk for the end, for the last wrong demo. Then we have a wrong usage of parallelism. So what we have here is a workflow that has a computer name parameter that supports an array of strings. Then he runs them against all domain controllers to get the information about last logon. So all this thing, this is all one command. Okay? See, he wants to get that parallelism running against all the domain controllers that will be here. But what we have learned today is that when you use a PS computer name, you don't need to do this thing. So the first thing here is you don't need to define this by yourself. Use the workflow common parameter PS computer name that it's created for you. Okay? So here, supply this, PS computer name. That moment, when you use that, you get that for each parallel by default. You don't even need it. So after that thing, you can completely erase this. Sorry. Erase this, and you will get the same thing. And then you can think, maybe the workflow is not the right tool for this at all. If I have that command, why wouldn't I use just invoke command and a simple PowerShell remoting? It will run by default against 32 domain controllers. Isn't that good enough for you? It's pretty good, right? Without thinking about limitations of a workflow. So just pick the right tool for the right job, right? Don't be just attracted by some of the features that you will get with the workflows, okay? Thank you for coming. This is the end. If you're interested in things connected to workflows, there are some sessions about SMA, and tomorrow we'll have more about desired state configuration, another great feature, and my session is the last one tomorrow, so I would be really happy to see you again. Enjoy the conference.